Welcome to Ludodrome. I'm Nate Behrens, and today we're going to play around with some games in black and white. Black and white film carries a lot of meaning in the world of cinema. It's emblematic of a classic bygone era of filmmaking, or of a certain seriousness of artistic endeavor. Even after color film became widely used, many filmmakers continued to shoot in black and white well into the 60s, both for economic and stylistic reasons. And while the style is rarely seen today, it crops up every now and then, often as a way of evoking a certain time period or subject matter. While games did have a black and white era, or more accurately a monochrome era, that stretched from the earliest days of the medium through the early 80s, the idea of black and white in gaming doesn't really carry the same weight. This is almost certainly because the days of monochrome gaming were before games reached any sort of artistic maturity or mainstream acceptance. Asteroids and Battlezone are obviously very important games, but they are a far cry from film's rich history of accomplished works made in black and white. Film had become a hugely popular and mature medium long before color was introduced. Not so for gaming. A better comparison might be pixel art, which today signals that a game either came from a bygone era or is consciously evoking it. But what if black and white imagery had become an important part of gaming's visual language? I came across a thread by Redditor Want on the r/TrueGaming subreddit, which, by the way, I highly recommend, which looked at screenshots of games converted into black and white and analyzed the effects. I've linked the original thread in the description so you can check it out for yourselves. The idea fascinated me, but I disagreed with many of his conclusions, and I wanted to see it in motion rather than in smallish thumbnails. So what I want to do is take a look at gameplay footage converted into black and white and see how it all turns out. Is it still readable? Is the gameplay changed or obfuscated? Is the atmosphere enhanced or diminished? And most importantly, does it look cool? I don't expect any of them to be so stunning that we'll all be convinced to play through the entire game that way, but maybe we can learn something about what works and what doesn't. Let's start with something very familiar. What happens when we switch to black and white? Well, we're not off to an illustrious start, even ignoring the fact that I'm terrible at Mario games, like, really bad. The lack of color doesn't do the art any favors, and Mario blends in more with the background, making it harder to track his movements when things are moving quickly. It doesn't break the game, but it's not great. Okay, but here's one weird trick doctors hate. In Mario 3, Mario and just about everything else has a 1-pixel black outline. In general, the game has a higher contrast look with fewer midtones. Compare the sky in Mario 1 with 3. But it's this outline that makes a huge difference. Suddenly it all works. Much of the charm and whimsy is lost. After all, Mario 3 is one of the most vividly colorful games on the NES, but it loses nothing in terms of playability. Large shapes defined by consistent outlines, lots of negative space, and high contrast ensure this game stays readable. I wouldn't choose to play the game this way, but it works. I've been playing through Final Fantasy VI recently, and I absolutely love its use of color, so of course that means we have to strip it out. It still remains pretty clear. Again, the characters have outlines and the pixel art is high contrast with highlights and shadows drawn in. Details that stick around once the color is removed. It actually looks kinda cool, but it also gets old fairly quickly. FF6 relies on its varied color palettes to represent the vast nature of its world, or worlds, and the variety of the characters, monsters, and locations contained within. Taking that away leaves a game that starts to feel pretty samey pretty fast, even if it still looks striking. The game actually does use monochrome every once in a while, primarily for flashback scenes, but it's sparing enough that it doesn't outstay its welcome. I'd pass on this one as well, even if the game remains totally playable. Here's a game that was a no-brainer to try out. Grim Fandango's veins run thick with film noir blood. Just look at Manny's office. And sure enough, when we switch to black and white, it looks like the game was designed that way from the start. The game remains completely readable. After all, the main character is literally black and white, and it looks pretty damn slick in my opinion. I'm sure there are puzzles that rely on color that I'm not remembering, so the game most likely couldn't be played through, beginning to end this way, but from an aesthetic standpoint, it holds up beautifully. Scenes are carefully lit and have a high dynamic range, all of which carries over to black and white. In fact, it's actually emphasized. And the fact that important items and characters are rendered in real time means they stand out distinctly against the pre-rendered backgrounds. This is a good look. Let's see. What else do I have around here? Well, I don't have a whole lot from the early 2000s on hand. Let's jump ahead a bit. Dark Souls has a much more muted color palette than the previous games we've looked at, and it's going for a far bleaker atmosphere than you typically see in a Mario game. So how does it fare? Well, it's certainly still bleak. Lordran feels just as, if not more, inhospitable in black and white. However, there are places where the conversion has essentially destroyed some of the finer details, especially in the shadows. The thing is, converting to black and white isn't as simple as just turning the saturation down to 0. With physical film, when shooting black and white, filmmakers use color filters on their lenses in order to block or allow certain wavelengths of light, changing the property of the final image. We can use those same properties to adjust the image in Premiere, imagining that the developers, if they had chosen to go with black and white, might do the same with a shader or some other effect. There we go. I brought up the shadows and now it's much more playable. That said, maybe it's just the flat lighting, but something's missing and I don't know that I would want to play the game like this. Either way, I'll apply a similar technique where needed from now on. We can actually see this in a game that includes an official black and white mode. Here's LA Noire, another game that's explicitly inspired by black and white Hollywood Golden Age films. The game was designed from the ground up to be playable in black and white, and the option can be toggled at any time in the menu. So here's the default game in color. Here's the game desaturated by me in Premiere, and here's the game in its unaltered black and white mode. You can see they're clearly tweaking the image beyond simple desaturation. And for good reason. LA Noire looks fantastic in black and white, arguably better than color. Black and white helps to reinforce the game's fantasy of living out 40s era detective films, and also perhaps the extra layer of abstraction helps to distract from some of the uncannier elements of the game's style. Some of the tiny details, such as these bullet casings, are still pretty hard to see, but to be fair, they were hard to see in color as well. Also worth noting that the official black and white mode leaves UI elements in color, allowing them to rely on color cues from map markers and button prompts. The Witcher 3 is one of the most graphically impressive games ever released. And surprisingly for a game that so often traffics in cruelty and moral ambiguity, one of its defining features is its warm, vivid color palette. In color, the landscape is colorful and inviting, even relaxing. It's as if nature is utterly indifferent to the suffering and violence around it. In black and white, the landscape changes dramatically, becoming instantly more foreboding and uninviting. It starts to feel almost like a wasteland of sorts. Conversations look great, with Geralt taking on an even more grizzled and stoic appearance. Yet, no matter how much time I spent playing with the image, some elements just don't work. The denser parts of the wilderness remain incredibly noisy and difficult to parse. Even the subtle color differences play a huge role in helping players differentiate the ground from foliage and trees. And Witcher Sense looks terrible without that splash of red. It's just a flat gray splotch. Like Final Fantasy and many other epic fantasy games, a large part of The Witcher's visual appeal are its vibrant colors. A colorful landscape, colorful clothing, colorful monsters, and it loses too much of that here to really recommend. This is an interesting one. As one of the more visually striking indie games in recent memory, Hyper Light Drifter actually works absolutely terribly in black and white. It uses a low-contrast color palette of mostly pastels with no outlines on objects, basically the opposite of what we saw in Mario 3 and Final Fantasy. It's a wonderful aesthetic, but in black and white it completely falls apart. The player and enemies blend into the ground, the color cues like the green lights on health packs disappear completely. The game becomes nearly unplayable. On the other hand, The Long Dark looks fantastic in black and white. The snow-covered landscape is the perfect setting for the stark contrast of the format. The game also has a low-poly, sparsely detailed art style full of strong lines and shapes that stand out against the sky and snow. The bleakness is maintained and even enhanced. I really dig this. Amnesia is a game all about stumbling through the shadows, catching glimpses of something in the distance. Black and white retains that, even deepening the sense of foreboding, and adds a kind of Vincent Price classic Hollywood horror vibe that fits surprisingly well. If there's one thing that No Man's Sky unequivocally nailed, it was the color. Mixing and matching hues to create vistas inspired by 70s sci-fi book covers, No Man's Sky, at the very least, had some stunning views. But when we take that away, space loses almost all of its appeal. Ironic considering space literally is black and white for the most part, but here No Man's Sky's colorful space works against itself, turning into a flat, gray expanse. It's almost like a metaphor. On the ground we fare a little better. The black and white landscapes become stark and inhospitable. But we lose the one characteristic of the game's procedurally generated planets that actually did feel truly varied. Without the bizarre alien combinations of hues in the earth and sky, we get a lot of planets that look even more similar than they already did, and the game loses what was left of its appeal. Finally, a very recent release, Dishonored 2. This was one of the first games I thought of when coming up with this video, partially because it takes place in a pseudo-Victorian fantasy world that has its own early form of black and white photography, and partially because it has an incredible art style that mixes illustrative techniques with realism. Whether it's the long, expressionistic shadows of the Addermeyer Institute, or the twilit walls of the Governor's Palace, the game looks great in black and white. Cinematography has been called sculpting with light, and Dishonored 2 is absolutely sculpting with its light, alternating pools of light and shadow in ways that make for great strategic stealth gameplay, and also happen to look just dandy in black and white. The way the lighting shapes spaces ensures that even without color, the relationship between elements of the environment, the walls, the floor, the detailing, the depth and scale, all remain very clear. The gameplay seems intact as well, except for the suspicion icons that pop up over enemies' heads, which become a flat gray that doesn't really draw the attention. But just about everything else carries over wonderfully. This looks fantastic, and unlike most of the other games here, I didn't have to touch the color balance before converting it to get a clear, readable result. Maybe it's because Karnaca is inspired in part by cities like Casablanca, which exists in my mind mostly in black and white because of the movie, but it all looks totally natural without color. I like this. So, What did we learn? I mean, clearly it's hit and miss. This isn't about to turn into a call to play all your games in black and white, as it's clearly a superior format, etc., etc. But there are a few things that seem consistent, and these tend to translate into good guidelines for readability in games whether they have color or not. High contrast graphics, especially the ones that use that contrast to differentiate between game objects, translate pretty well. Stripping away the color doesn't damage their playability, and is more likely to translate into a readable image rather than a bunch of noise or gray splotches. The same goes for games with lots of negative space and strong, solid shapes rather than lots of wispy, fine details. That seems to mean urban environments mostly, or something like the Long Dark's low-detail wilderness. And it seems that 150 years or so of film history has set our, or at least my, tastes when it comes to the subject matter of black and white visuals. Of the games I tried, it was primarily those that had settings similar to popular black and white film genres that worked. Other games, like The Witcher, might have looked alright, but lost too much of their identity for the Switch to be worth it. Now, give me The Witcher as a Technicolor extravaganza, and we'll talk. So, yeah, this was a fun way to get a new perspective on some very familiar games. And while in the vast majority of cases it's not the better way to play, it's still interesting to see how or why that's the case. The fact is, there are so many games I could have picked. I can think of dozens more I'd like to try off the top of my head. It sounds like I might just have to make another episode of this down the line. What games do you want to see in black and white? What games would look amazing? What games would completely fall apart? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.